Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the final weekend of June 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Established in 2019 by the Franklin News Foundation, the Center Square publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories and they add insights to those headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Today, we'll discuss the peace efforts between Israel and Iran. We'll hear about the NATO summit, and we'll look at higher education funding in Pennsylvania. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more in the Middle East, let's now go to Dan McCaleb. It's been a tumultuous week in the Middle East, with the U.S. last weekend joining Israel's bombing campaign against Iranian nuclear sites. The Trump administration says its use of massive bunker buster bombs dropped by B-2 bombers in a meticulously planned stealth campaign obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities. Iran disputes that and attempted to retaliate by firing missiles at a U.S. military base in Qatar, but the missiles caused no damage. President Donald Trump then negotiated a ceasefire between Israel and Iran, the terms of which both countries immediately violated. An angry Trump dropped an F-bomb on live TV when asked about Israel breaking the terms of the ceasefire, but things have mostly quieted since then. Joining me to discuss this is the Center Square's regional editor, Steve Wilson, a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard, where he served as a fire control technician and participated in numerous drug busts and exercises with allied navies. Steve, thank you for joining us. As of Friday morning, what's the latest on this conflict?
I think right now, the proverbial dust is just settling. Right now, we're in a phase where we're trying to figure out, did we actually set their nuclear program back months or years or maybe even weeks? The thing is with those bunker busters is you really need to have someone on the ground. I know Trump was talking about the Israelis had someone on the ground, some agents, and they quickly denied that. But you really need someone on the ground to find out how much damage was really done to these complexes, which are buried under tons of rock.
It was an incredible mission, seeing it play out. We're not actually seeing it play out, but hearing about it, and how, these B-2 bombers flew from their base in Missouri all the way across, the world, with, refueling midair, getting into Iran with absolutely no detection, no crossfire coming back at them, and then back to Missouri, all in what was it, like a 30-hour period. Remarkable. Then Trump negotiates this peace deal, but it is immediately broken. And boy, was Trump, you could tell Trump was extremely upset when he dropped that F-bomb, on national television.
Well, I think the thing about the mission, I mean, at 37 hours in a cockpit, I mean, that's rough for any pilots, but the bomber pilots of the U.S. Air Force, back when it was the Strategic Air Command during the Cold War, they were doing missions like this all the time. In fact, they were on airborne alert with armed nuclear bombs, which caused a couple of what they call broken arrows, which were problematic. But they've been doing this for years. But when you think about how many planes were involved in this strike, 125 aircraft, 52 refueling tankers. And what happens with these refueling tankers, they fly these little, what they call racetrack patterns. And the B-2s, because these MOPs, as they call them, the massive ordnance penetrators, are 30,000 pounds apiece. They've got two of them. The B-2s couldn't take off with a full fuel load. So they had to actually refuel multiple times before they got over there. They call it feet wet, feet dry. So feet dry when you're in Iran, when they're feet wet back over the ocean, and they had to refuel again. So, you're talking a massive use of American air power. And this mission is one of those things that, and the thing people don't realize is the synchronicity that was involved in setting this up.
Of course, President Trump has been saying for years and years that Iran cannot and will not build a nuclear bomb. That is the biggest concern. Trump has also said he wants to get the U.S. out of war, peace through power. Right. So some people have said that this contradicts what Trump campaigned on. But when you think about the threat of a nuclear Iran who has vowed to destroy Israel, has vowed to destroy America, it's understandable that the president is standing by his word that he will not allow Iran to build nuclear bombs.
I think one thing that's an issue for President Trump is I think he was surprised that a lot of people in his base, the MAGA people, were not really excited about this strike. I think a lot of them felt like that this was an unwarranted incursion into a war between Israel and Iran. And he had, like you said, campaigned on no new foreign wars. And the thing is with this strike, I think he was surprised by that. And it's interesting to note that that we've had this kind of back and forth. The Iranians are saying, no, you didn't set our nuclear program back. And he and Hegseth and others are saying that, we obliterated it. We destroyed it. So the thing that's going to be interesting going forward for him is, can he shore up his base at home? And also after the 2 weeks, promise that he made that, we're going to make a decision in 2 weeks. And then we went ahead and did it. How does he repair himself diplomatically abroad?
In the few moments we have left, Steve, I'm going to ask you to speculate. We have had a couple of days where there's been no crossfire missiles from Iran and Israel, but it's still a tenuous situation. What comes next?
Well, I think the issue for Israel and why they were so willing to agree to a ceasefire is they're running out of interceptor missiles that shoot down the Iranian ballistic missiles. And just from what I've seen, I think the Iranian ballistic missiles and their sophistication and ability to pinpoint targets inside Israel, which is not a very big country, I think it caught them by surprise. And the thing is with these surface-to-air missiles is we can't build a lot of them. I mean, you're talking maybe we can build 100 a year. And and supposedly Iran has like maybe a couple thousand, ballistic missiles. That's math that just doesn't add up.
Thank you for joining us today, Steve. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Steve. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on NATO, let's return now to Dan McCaleb.
Amid the conflict between Israel and Iran over Iran's nuclear ambitions, President Donald Trump flew to the Netherlands and Europe early this week for a NATO summit, where he got most European NATO members to increase their defense spending to 5% of GDP. The summit occurred as the Trump administration continues to negotiate trade deals with the European Union and as a self-imposed deadline to reach tariff agreements looms in early July. Joining me to discuss this is Brett Rowland, the Center Square's tariff guru. Brett, let's start with Trump's demand that NATO countries increase their spending on defense as the war between Russia and Ukraine continues and tensions in the Middle East remain high. What happened there?
So this is a big deal, and this is something that a lot of people have wanted for many years. So for the goal for GDP is these countries, the 32 NATO nations are expected to spend 2% of GDP on defense. So they have not been doing that. Many of them have never met that 2% target. Or not, I shouldn't say many. Some of them have never met that 2% target. But now Trump has bumped it, more than doubled it to 5%. So this is huge. And we've got many of the nations to agree. There's obviously been some pushback, but I think the real challenge will come in actually making sure that these countries that have pledged to hit 5% do hit 5%. Because like I said before, there were some countries that struggled to meet the 2% target. So more than doubling it is going to be a challenge for a lot of these nations. But this stuff comes as, we see trouble in spots all around the world. Russia and China are concerns for many of these nations. So is the conflicts in the Middle East. So I think that the spending comes in an appropriate time, but whether or not they can get everyone to actually pay the money, I think is going to be the challenge.
President Trump has been highly critical of, the massive amounts of money the U.S. has given to the Ukraine, not just money, but also weapons and other military equipment, while at the same time saying Europe is not carrying its weight. So assuming these countries have agreed to up their defense spending to 5%, we won't know for years if that's actually going to happen. But he reached this agreement. That's got to be considered a win for the president.
Oh, for Trump, that's a huge win. I mean, this is something he's been pushing. He's been trying to push everyone to increase spending for years, and to get this kind of a big win at NATO, in a one-day summit when he's got a lot of other plates up in the air, like he's juggling a lot of things, is a huge win for him. Especially to be able to come home with a solid promise saying, 5% instead of up from 2%. So, I think that that's a really big win for him.
All right, let's segue now to tariffs. Brett, of course, Trump put in place his Liberation Day tariffs back in April, causing the stock market to drop significantly. A week later, he pulled those back, left baseline tariffs in place, gave himself a July deadline to negotiate deals with European nation countries, but also countries around the globe. Where are we at?
So, we've got a lot of work to do. Now, Trump has since he announced those reciprocal tariffs, Trump has brought home he's brought home 2 deals, a limited deal with the UK that covers some aspects of both economies, some trade goods, and he's essentially carved out a trade truce with China. So not a true trade deal, but, I guess things are better than they were when they started. So, Howard Lutnick said this morning, that they've got between 10 or 15 deals that they hope to present before the July 9th, deadline. That would represent most of the U.S. key trading partners, but there's probably, scores of other nations that may not get the same time to negotiate, may not get to really have a say in their terms at all. Trump has said a couple times now that the deadline's not all that important, and that at some point he's just going to dictate terms, which they can either take or leave. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of days. But it is interesting how far we've moved from this deadline to Trump's just going to take to essentially dictate terms to the rest of the world. And he feels really confident that he can do that given the U.S. negotiating position here.
And these negotiations are ongoing as several groups in the United States have filed suit against Trump, saying Congress has not given him the authority to unilaterally set tariff deadlines. Where are we at with those lawsuits?
So that's a good question. So we've got a hearing coming up July 31st, I believe. So, a group of states and a group of small businesses have each filed suit. Those suits have been combined at the appellate level. So, we're looking at the federal appeals court now. The government filed its first response earlier this week, and they basically said, we've got the power to do this, and please don't interrupt our months and months of strategic negotiations with other countries. And if you do rule against us, we're going straight to the Supreme Court. So Trump's made his position clear. Now the other side of this coin, the businesses are not happy. They're not happy that Trump gets to keep collecting the tariffs while everything's under review. They want the tariffs to go immediately. And some of these businesses have said, hey, we're going to go out of business long before the courts resolve this. So I think that there's a lot of frustration on both sides here, and tariffs are, while you and I probably haven't seen tariff prices, really affect things. I think these small businesses, especially those that are dependent on suppliers from China, like this one company that I was talking to a couple of weeks ago, everything they get comes from China. So, And it's a small business it's a mom and pop shop. So, they can't find other suppliers. So I think those businesses are struggling while this plays out in the courts. And I don't think that, anyone really wanted this to be as part of the U.S. court system, but here we are.
Thank you for joining us today, Brett. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Big thanks to Dan and Brett. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on higher ed funding in Pennsylvania, let's now return again to Dan McCaleb.
Kristen, last week we dug into hundreds of millions of dollars in research grants awarded to three prominent Pennsylvania universities from Biden-era spending bills, and an ongoing debate over whether the federal government should be spending so much on such research because of the administrative bloat it leads to and other potential impacts on taxpayers and students. Today, let's talk about the two different higher education systems in the state, how they are funded differently. It is budget season after all, and how the two systems are on an unequal footing. Why don't we start by explaining the two different systems, Kristen?
Okay. At its most basic level, we have something called state-related universities, which is probably what everyone thinks of when they think of Pennsylvania, which would be Penn State, University of Pittsburgh, and then Temple University and Lincoln University. And they're called state-related because they are in the state and they get a little bit of funding from the state government, but they get a lot of funding from the federal government and philanthropic donations. Then there's what we have, the Pennsylvania system of higher education. And that includes 14 universities that are state run. And that means that they get the majority of their funding from the state. And so that's the easiest way to describe the difference.
And the state-based systems, such as Penn State, University of Pittsburgh, Temple, they have large endowments compared to the other schools. Is that correct?
Correct. We are looking at multi-billion dollars for the state-related versus, millions for the state-run schools. I think of the more successful schools, their numbers for endowments are in the 65 million-ish range. So as compared to something like Penn State, where they have $22 billion. So you're looking at a very wide gap here in terms of resources that these universities have.
Right. But both groups go before the state legislature every year during budget season and make requests, and the legislature has to decide how much to fund them.
Absolutely. And it's certainly more high stakes for the state run system, again, because they get so much funding from the state, and they've really been highlighted as the way for Pennsylvania to kind of climb out of its demographic hole that it's in by attracting college students to Pennsylvania to come to school here and then stay here and work here, because we have a real problem with losing younger workers to other states that have better opportunities for them. And one of the ways that PASHE does that is by maintaining a really affordable tuition. They have not raised tuition in 7 years. And that's pretty remarkable when you consider the inflationary pressures that everyone is facing, not to mention state government and the state-run system. And when you think about, for example, the tuitions at the state-related universities like Penn State and Pitt, where that have continued to go up despite getting all of this additional funding, having large endowments, and having just more resources in order to fund their programs and to keep tuition affordable for students.
So where are they at in the various groups in the budgeting process?
It's a great question. Our budget in Pennsylvania is due June 30th, but leadership has already signaled that that is just a goal that they don't plan on reaching. And so the funding for PASHE and for the state related is really tied up in that. I'm sure that the universities will just continue on, but there's going to be a great uncertainty for them, which trickles down to the students. It's really not a great place for, administrators to be, as far as not being able to say what their finances are going to be for the next year. There's an added element to this, a pretty large element, and that's from Congress and their budget bill that they're working on, One Big Beautiful Budget. There's a lot of changes to higher education funding that would make a massive difference even for state-related universities. They're talking about reducing Pell Grants for lower-income students, but also reforming how student loans are written by the government, because there's wide agreement that they're predatory and that middle-class students are really helping to fund these universities because of their endless supply of student loans that will help fund them. And can, by some critics argue, allow them to continue raising tuition despite all of these other costs that are coming and all these other resources that are coming to them. So it's perhaps in more, much more so than years past, these universities are really in limbo as far as what the federal government's going to do, what the state government's going to do. The state government is looking to what the federal government is going to do. So this is really, it's a mess, quite frankly.
And this isn't exclusive to Pennsylvania, although that's our focus today, of course, but what's going on in Congress with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, what, President Trump, since taking office has, he of course created the Department of Government Efficiency, which has been looking at what it considers to be bloat or waste or fraud and cutting that. And the federal government is on a different fiscal year, than the state of Pennsylvania, for example. So I can understand how much uncertainty that is creating. What do you expect when it comes to the budget? June 30th is a deadline, you said, but they're probably not going to hit that. How much work is left to do at the state level?
At the state level, that's a great question. The sticking points have nothing to do with higher education. As far as we know, the state is more focused on mass transit funding, on regulating and taxing skill games. They do always have a pretty strong focus on education as a whole, and there has been more money given to the state system year after year. That's because it is their main responsibility as the state is to fund that system. State relateds have been more controversial, for a lot of the reasons that I discussed before. They're very, dependent on federal research dollars. They might have policies that, again, have nothing to do with federal research, such as how they feel about transgender athletes and how they compete on their athletic teams. And so they've kind of been the target of the Trump administration as far as looking for that waste, fraud, and abuse. And that's kind of what our research was going to with this story, was to kind of really take a deep dive at these three very public-facing universities, which also includes the University of Pennsylvania, which is private. It is not state-related. But they receive the bulk of research funding for medical, for national defense, for engineering and science development. And again, as I said, a state-run system like PASHE is making it work by charging students less than $8,000 a semester. Then you have these giants as far as the university system in Pennsylvania that get all of this support and have all these unlimited resources. And in the case of the University of Pennsylvania, their tuition has risen more than 45% in the last 10 years. Yeah. So you have to really, it's hard to know because it is such a complex web. And to be clear, this research funding is very important. The University of Pennsylvania, some of the researchers there that helped develop the mRNA technology for, vaccines, they won prizes for that research. University of Pittsburgh does a ton of medical research. There is the University or Penn State that really focuses on national security and engineering. They've done a lot of really important things with their money. So no one's saying, oh, take all of the research money. But what they're saying is, how does this tie into the affordability of these colleges? And there seems to be a lot of debate as to whether or not that should be a factor when we're looking at how to reform tuition for students.
Thank you for your insights, Kristen. Listeners can keep up with this series of stories that Kristen and her team produced at thecentersquare.com, and for ongoing coverage of the state budget.
Thanks to Dan and Kristen. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What is the state of job growth in California? Will Ohio's EdChoice scholarship program be struck down by the courts? And do housing trends point to an economic downturn? We'll have all that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers arrested 11 Iranian men with criminal histories in the country illegally, including 2 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps members. The arrests were made after more than 1,500 Iranians illegally entered the U.S. under the Biden administration, with more than 700 released into the U.S. itself. All 11 Iranian foreign nationals arrested remain in ICE custody pending removal proceedings. The arrest took place as the Department of Homeland Security issued a warning to all Americans to be on a heightened threat alert after the U.S. bombed Iranian nuclear targets last weekend. House Republicans and Democrats sparred over codifying cuts proposed by the Department of Government Efficiency
U.S. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said during a House committee hearing that Congress needs to, quote unquote, lock in DOJ's $180 billion in cuts across the federal government. Greene also pointed to a $9 billion rescissions package passed in the House that would make cuts to several international organizations, non-governmental organizations, as well as public media, including NPR and PBS. Democrats on the committee disagreed with the sentiment of cementing DOJ cuts. U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas called for a subpoena of Elon Musk to investigate DOJ's actions. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell told Congress this week that economic data merited lower interest rates, but that tariffs could undo the central bank's fight to tame inflation. Under pressure from President Donald Trump to lower interest rates, Powell tried to avoid the political fray as he faced questions from Democrats and Republicans at a House Financial Services Committee hearing. Powell told lawmakers that inflation pressures remain contained. The Fed will cut rate, quote, sooner rather than later, end quote, but without specifying when. Trump told Congress before the hearing got underway to put pressure on Powell to lower interest rates. Republicans warn that Democrat socialist Zohran Mamdani's victory in New York City's mayoral primary means his far-left platform could raise taxes, spike crime, and usher in ultra-liberal policies for the nation's largest city. Mamdani, a state assemblyman from Queens, pulled off a stunning upset Tuesday over former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo in a crowded Democrat primary. While the election will technically be decided by another ranked choice tally next week, Cuomo may return to the race as an independent. The University of Wisconsin system has seen significant increases in staff and salaries over the past 10 years, while student enrollment has dropped by 16,000, according to an audit. Republican State Senator Eric Wimberger said the system has lost its way and is mired in administrative bloat, wasteful spending, and discriminatory DEI practices. The data was released as the UW system is asking for an $855 million increase in funding in the next biennial budget. The data was released as the UW system is asking for an $855 million increase in funding in the next biennial budget. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
He ran for state office and was beaten. Started a business and failed. Ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on job growth in California, let's now go to Keegan Kernodle.
Joining me today is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Today, we're talking about some data you found that California lost jobs in 2024 and that there were no jobs created. Kenneth, can you explain this and dig into it a little bit for us?
Hey, Keegan. So I saw a new report from the state-funded Legislative Analyst's Office about data from the fourth quarter of 2024, finding that there was no job creation. They used this federal data set that I then went into and found that the state had actually not gained any jobs in 2024. In fact, it only lost jobs. The state lost 80,300 jobs between January and December of 2024. This report was pretty damning, though. It also found that the monthly jobs reports have overestimated jobs growth by about 25,000 jobs per month. This means that, as we've known all along, these monthly snapshot job surveys, they might be good at a very macro level, to just estimate general employment levels, but they are not very sensitive at the edges.
You reported that Newsom has said California is the fourth largest economy and that jobs are going great there. Yes,
that does not seem to be the case. And it's really not apparent that California is the world's fourth largest economy because that uses the economy size in dollars. The difference is, though, the world economy is not priced in dollars. The world's economies are priced in the local currency. So if you're going to compare the economies of different places, you need to see how much stuff and services you can buy in that local currency based on the productivity of that country. This is called purchasing power parity and is actually a more accurate measure of the relative size performance of economies. Once you do that, California is only barely ahead of economic heavyweights Italy and Turkey, and well behind the United Kingdom. So California is ranked 11th once you actually account for the extremely high cost in California, and the relative strength of the dollar compared to other currencies.
And now, as far as the job creation goes, I know there's been touts in California of creating lots of jobs as well.
Right.
Despite what this is showing.
Right. So we have recent reports showing that there were a lot of there have been some continued private sector job losses. We've lost, I believe, about 200,000 private sector jobs since early 2023. Most of that has been more than offset gains in government and taxpayer funded jobs. But the reality is that in some months, the plurality of these jobs are from a welfare program called in-home supportive services, where if you are elderly or disabled and you're enrolled in Medi-Cal, which 40% of Californians are, you have to be very low income to qualify for Medi-Cal. So that just shows you 40% of Californians are so poor that they are eligible and enrolled in Medi-Cal, that you can pay a household member minimum wage to provide care for you. You can even get overtime hours for this. So we now have 742,300 Californians who are getting paid as IHSS providers. They work an average of 31 hours a week, which is about $505 a week on average, or $26,300 per year. And it's not clear what services are being provided for 31 hours a week of employment. You know, when you're caring for a family member, it can be really time consuming, and it is something that can make it harder for you to have a job. So I understand why this program would exist, but there are nearly 1 million people who are now working in this program, and it's accounted for significant amounts of the quote jobs that have been added to the state. And that doesn't really suggest strength as a basis of the state's economy.
So up to how many hours, service hours can be provided per month? And, who's funding this?
So IHSS recipients can get up to 283 hours of assistance per month. That's over 70 hours a week. That could be a substantial income. That's paid for by the taxpayer, but these program costs are shared with federal taxpayers as well. So, I believe there's a 50% reimbursement rate from federal taxpayers. There are certain individuals who have reimbursement rates of up to 90%, but it's somewhere between 50 and 90% based on the recipient. And state and county governments are left with the rest of the tab. There was another LAO report on the IHSS program in California, and they said, this is quite concerning, quote, caseloads are growing at an increasing rate. So, the state expects a quarter of Californians to be 60 or older by 2030. We're having a demographic inversion happening in the state where, the average age is rapidly increasing, and the number of people who are retired or on government services is also rapidly growing. So when you have a growing number of dependents to workers, at a certain point, you can't afford to maintain these benefits.
Well, thank you, Kenneth, for getting into this with us. Readers can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Keegan and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the court striking down Ohio's EdChoice scholarship program, let's now return again to Dan McCaleb. A Franklin County, Ohio judge has struck down the state's EdChoice program as unconstitutional. The program provides taxpayer-funded vouchers to parents of students to use to send their kids to private school and for other purposes. The judge is allowing the program to continue as the state appeals. Joining me to discuss this is regional editor J.D. Davidson. J.D., tell us about the ruling and the program itself.
Thanks, Dan. The ruling's not surprising. the ongoing battle for school choice in the state has probably ramped up. Well, since I joined the Center Square, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, this lawsuit came about. Gosh, it feels like it started almost 2 or 3 years ago, but probably not that long. It was a group of 200 school districts that joined a group, amazingly enough, called Vouchers Hurt Ohio, and filed this suit in Franklin County. Obviously, Franklin County is the home of Columbus. It's a big Democratic stronghold. It's an elected judge, but most elected officials in Franklin County are Democrats. So it wasn't surprising, that this ruling came out. There is, I think, a legitimate controversy over using taxpayer funds for private schools. But the judge immediately, in his ruling, he plainly said you cannot use taxpayer money to fund private schools at the expense of adequately funding public schools. Now, the question, and you and I have worked in a lot of states, and I've been in Georgia and Alabama and Texas and Ohio, and this question has appeared in every state that I've worked in, is what does adequately fund mean?
Right.
There's no answer for that. But he did stay the ruling, allow the folks who are using the scholarships now, the vouchers now, to continue while the state, obviously is going to appeal. The appeal will go, to I believe it's the 10th Court of Appeals. I'm not positive on that. I do know that it's almost all Republican judges. The state Supreme, then it'll go to the state and Supreme Court, which is also almost all Republican judges. I would be surprised if the ruling holds, but it'll just continue the debate of sending taxpayer dollars to private schools, which has grown dramatically in the last 5 years. The current budget that the state's operating under, which ends, I guess, midnight Monday, there's $1 billion for the voucher program. That'll increase in the budget that was passed by the House and Senate yesterday, slightly. There are several scholarship programs in the state. Some deal with special ed students. One is focused entirely on Cleveland. So they've increased some of the smaller ones, around the state in the new budget.
The program itself is not that relatively old, right? It just was approved a few years ago, and then they expanded it last legislative session. Am I right about that?
No, the EdChoice program probably has been around, and I don't know this for sure, but I know it was around before I came on with the Center Square. So I'm going to say at least a decade, but it was a small program. And over the last 2 budget cycles, it has increased dramatically to where now anybody is eligible. And what was interesting, and I live in a small town in North.
When you say anyone, you're talking about income level, family's income level?
Income level, anybody is eligible. That happened at the last budget cycle 2 years ago. And I live in a small northeast Ohio town, or north central Ohio town, with one small Catholic elementary school. It's been around for 100 years, and it's K through 8. They never really advertised or promoted. You just knew in town that there was the public school system, and then there was St. Vincent. When that budget passed 2 years ago, they started really promoting the idea that you can get a scholarship now to come here, and you can come here, and you can come here to try to grow. And you grew up in Ohio, just like I did, and there's always been this us versus them with public schools and parochial schools in the state, especially when it comes to athletics. And that's kind of an underlying theme of all of this as well.
So the ruling comes as states across the country, many of them, and you mentioned the political party affiliations of the judges, the local judges, mostly Democrats, at the appeals level and Supreme Court level, mostly Republicans. It does seem to have become a partisan issue. The state of Texas, just this year passed its first school choice program. Governor Greg Abbott in the state has made it a priority to create a school choice program over multiple legislative terms. In Texas, the state legislature only meets every 2 years, and going back at least 6 years, Governor Abbott in Texas has tried to expand it. He finally got it across the finish line this year. Arizona and Florida have recently expanded their school choice program. So it does seem it's become a red state, blue state type of thing, or a Democrat, Republican type of thing, which I don't know if that makes sense to me. I get it. I mean, it is. You can't deny that it's not a Republican issue. Pro-school choice are generally Republicans. Anti-school choice are generally Democrats. But we are out of time, JD. Thank you for joining us. Listeners can can keep up with this story and all education-related stories at thecentersquare.com/education.
Thank you, Dan and JD. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Join me to discuss how housing and other markers are pointing to an economic slowdown. It's Dr. Orphe Divounguy. I want to talk to you about, well, first of all, let's start with some census data. So last week, new residential construction report came out for May 2025, and it is suggesting that perhaps the brakes are being tapped on new building. And as you and I were talking over the past couple of hours, as we were doing a little bit of show prep, you think that that's perhaps a bit foreboding?
Yeah. I mean, look, historically, housing has always been a kind of leading indicator of things to come in the U.S. economy. If you think about it, more than, 30 to 50% of your monthly expenditures are basically your housing costs. And so for some people, and so it plays a huge role when the housing market starts to slow down, when prices, and by the way, prices are forecasted to fall, right? We just had a Case-Shiller report that showed basically price growth is easing faster than expected. And so basically there's a couple of things. The first thing is, this wealth effect. Well, when homeowners feel less wealthy, they go out and spend less. And so, of course, that shows up in consumer spending and, of course, the large chunk of U.S. economic growth. And so that you end up with a slowdown in economic growth. You also have all of the services that go around, with housing, right? So when sales are down, when home sales are down, you also get real estate agents are not doing as well. Financialists don't go out and spend a ton of money. Builders are pulling back, and you're seeing data already. Builders have pulled back significantly. Housing starts were down 4.6% when compared to a year ago in May, right? Total housing starts. So builders pulling back means, well, they're spending less on building products and materials and components. It also means they're hiring fewer workers. And so all of that just compounds, right? And it means a big chunk of the U.S. economy is slowing down very rapidly. And again, historically, the data tells us that housing is extremely responsive to changes in interest rates, right? And it's usually the first one to go before the U.S. economy goes under. So I'm not predicting a recession yet. I don't think that's my baseline forecast, but I see a slowdown. And I see the labor market poised to weaken further in the months ahead.
What are the other pieces of data that we should be looking at? And I want to kind of jump into the broader market. We talked earlier this week with, personal consumption, and the PCE. I mean, you're a keen watcher, obviously, of a number of different data points. What's the next data point that you're looking toward for info?
I mean, it's the PCE right now, right? So we're going to see the PCE coming out this week. I think that's going to be a big one. But ultimately, I'd love to see whether or not I'm really focused on whether or not initial unemployment claims continue to rise. Right? We're seeing more and more people are staying unemployed for longer because hiring rates are very low. And so if you continue to see the unemployment claims continue to rise rapidly, the unemployment rate could be poised to increase. And unfortunately, the unemployment rate never really increases in a linear fashion. it tends to tick up a little bit at first and then it goes. And so that's what I think the Fed, is going to be having to watch out for. And that's potentially why I'm a big proponent of, a preemptive rate cut, in July.
Yeah. Can we talk about that just for a moment, just to kind of catch everybody up? I mean, at least within sort of this episode, we had talked, you and I, for months about rate cuts, and it didn't look like it was coming. It didn't look like it was coming. What is in the data overall that you're seeing that's suggesting? Because Christopher Waller, one of the governors, I mean, is somebody whose opinion you really respect and whose ideas I think you follow along with very, very closely, said, I mean, it's like, I think I want to paraphrase. I certainly don't want to quote because I do not have the quote in front of me. He intimated that we were going to see a cut at some point here soon.
Yeah. I mean, he defended the case for July rate cut essentially. And, I mean, inflation's at 2.1% right now. I mean, we're going to see the PCE. There's so much downside risk that perhaps, the balance has shifted towards, maybe a cut is more appropriate at this point. And it could be a rate cut. It could be a one-time rate cut and then pausing again to see how the economy reacts to that rate cut. I think that is very, very smart, given that we know, from the past that once the labor market goes, then it's very hard to contain, layoffs, right? When businesses are uncertain about the future, they pull back and they pull back significantly, in order to kind of protect themselves, to save themselves and live to fight another day, right? Very few businesses will forecast the downturn, will see demand slowing and continue at the same pace, right? They'd rather pull back and see if they can kind of survive a tough time, right? And usually the way they do that is to protect the profit margins is to basically cut workers. And we really don't want to see that. And so I think, remember the Fed's mandate, inflation and unemployment, but also financial stability. And the last thing we want is to see, inflation being already so close to the Fed's target, right? There's just no reason to let the unemployment rate, rise, significantly from here.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug. And on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.